Welcome to Young Patriots.
Imagine waking up this morning reaching for your phone to check the news, only to discover that one of the most powerful tech companies in the world just lost an entire continent overnight. $30 billion gone in the blink of an eye. Not because of a system crash, not because of a cyber attack, but because 1.4 billion people in Africa decided together that they would no longer allow their data, their dreams, and their digital future to remain in the hands of Amazon Web Services. For more than a decade, AWS has been regarded as the backbone of the global internet. From hospitals storing medical records, to banks protecting financial transactions, to entire governments depending on Amazon's cloud infrastructure. Yet last night, Africa rewrote the rules. A continent once dismissed and underestimated pulled the plug, disconnecting Amazon from their systems and switching to a brand new platform built and owned by Africans themselves. This is not merely a story about technology. It is a political and economic earthquake. The question we must all ask is, why now? What gave African leaders, including Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré, the courage to challenge one of America's tech giants? And more importantly, how will this reshape the future of the internet, not only in Lagos or Ouagadougou, but in Washington and New York as well? Stay with me in this video, because what just happened does not only change Amazon's game, it may signal the dawn of a new era where digital sovereignty becomes as crucial as territorial sovereignty. And if you believe that the truth matters more than the headlines, make sure to subscribe, because this is just the beginning of a story that could shake the entire world. The story begins not in Silicon Valley, but on the streets of Ouagadougou, Lagos, Johannesburg, and Nairobi. For months, there had been whispers that something was coming. African governments, often criticized for being too slow to adapt to the digital age, had been quietly preparing a surprise that no one in Seattle could have anticipated. Then, almost overnight, the switch was flipped. Amazon Web Services, the $500 billion arm of Amazon that hosts much of the world's digital infrastructure, was cut off from an entire continent. $30 billion in contracts, partnerships, and projected growth disappeared before dawn. To understand the magnitude of this event, we need to remember what AWS really is. Amazon Web Services is not just a cloud platform. It is the hidden power behind much of the modern internet. Netflix runs on it. Major banks process transactions on it. Even U.S. government agencies, from intelligence to defense, depend on AWS servers. For years, Africa too had been plugged into this network, storing sensitive data, paying billions in annual fees, and remaining dependent on technology built thousands of miles away. But in the weeks leading up to this moment, African leaders had grown restless. With each passing year, it became clearer that this dependency was not only expensive, but dangerous. Data was flowing out of Africa and into the hands of corporations that answered not to African citizens, but to shareholders and U.S. regulators. The continent was paying for access, but not building its own capacity. For a region that has been striving for independence since the end of colonialism, the digital age had begun to feel like a new form of submission. The turning point came when the alliance of Sahel states Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger announced a bold plan to build and operate their own continental cloud system. The announcement, at first dismissed as symbolic, soon gained traction. South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya, three of Africa's biggest digital economies, began exploratory talks with the alliance. Within months, a coalition of 20 African governments had quietly signed agreements to migrate their national data away from AWS and toward what they called Africa Cloud. Then came the night of the cut. Engineers across multiple time zones working under strict secrecy rerouted traffic from Amazon servers to new data centers located in Ouagadougou, Johannesburg, and Lagos. By the time most Americans had gone to bed, AWS dashboards in Seattle were already showing a red wall of error messages, thousands of African accounts suspended, billions of dollars in contracts frozen, entire data streams gone. For Amazon, the immediate loss was staggering. $30 billion in revenue evaporated. For Africa, the gain was symbolic, even spiritual. For the first time, the continent had stood up to one of the world's most powerful corporations and declared, "Our data belongs to us." The announcement the following morning was not made by Jeff Bezos nor by AWS executives. It came from African presidents standing side by side, declaring what they called a day of digital independence. They spoke not of revenge nor of hostility toward the United States, but of sovereignty, of reclaiming the right to control the very information that powers modern life. President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso went further. "We once allowed our gold, our cotton, and our oil to be extracted and shipped away. We will not make the same mistake with our data," he said. His words echoed across African news outlets, igniting celebrations from students, engineers, and small business owners who had long felt invisible in the global digital economy. The scale of the transition stunned the world. Overnight universities across Africa were logging into servers powered not by Amazon, but by African-built data centers. Hospitals were uploading patient records to encrypted local systems. Even rural entrepreneurs were accessing apps that now ran on African infrastructure. What had seemed impossible just weeks earlier had become reality. The sheer speed of the operation suggested meticulous planning and international coordination. While details remain secret, analysts suspect collaboration with foreign partners, perhaps Russia, perhaps China, who provided technical expertise. But African leaders were careful to emphasize that Africa Cloud was not a foreign handout. It was designed, funded, and led by Africans with the help of African engineers from the diaspora who had returned home to build something lasting. The event was more than just a technological switch. It was a statement to the world: Africa will no longer be a passive consumer of global technology. It will be a producer, an innovator, and a defender of its own digital sovereignty. If the decision to pull the plug on Amazon Web Services was the spark, the reactions that followed were the firestorm. By dawn, as the first headlines hit the airwaves, the world realized the magnitude of what had just happened. The global media called it the Great Digital Exodus. In Silicon Valley, shockwaves rippled through boardrooms. On Wall Street, traders scrambled as Amazon stock fell sharply within the opening minutes. But the most powerful reaction came not from markets or media, but from the clash of voices, African American and global, trying to define what this event really meant. In Washington, emergency briefings were convened. The U.S. Senate Commerce Committee demanded answers from Amazon executives. Was this merely a technical dispute, or had the United States just lost its grip on an entire continent's digital infrastructure? One senator described it as the most significant tech setback for America since the rise of Huawei. Another warned that Africa's move could embolden other regions, South America, the Middle East, to follow suit. Inside Amazon's headquarters, executives went into crisis mode. The CEO of AWS released a statement calling the development deeply concerning, warning that disruptions of this scale put global security at risk. Yet his words rang hollow for many Africans who had long argued that it was Amazon's monopoly, not Africa's independence, that threatened stability. Tech analysts noted the irony: the same company that once touted resilience and decentralization was now crying foul when a continent demanded precisely those things for itself. On the streets of Ouagadougou, the mood was the opposite of crisis. Young people poured out in celebration, waving flags and chanting slogans about digital freedom. Students at the University of Ouaga live-streamed the moment on platforms powered by Africa Cloud, proudly pointing to the fact that their content was being hosted not in Virginia or Dublin, but in their own country. In Lagos, crowds gathered outside new data centers, treating them like national monuments. In Johannesburg, newspapers ran bold headlines: "Africa unplugs Amazon." President Ibrahim Traoré's fiery speech added fuel to the moment. Standing in military fatigues, he declared, "They took our resources, they took our labor, but they will not take our future. Our data is our gold, and it belongs to Africa." His words were replayed across African airwaves and quickly trended worldwide. To many Africans, Traoré had not only confronted Amazon but also exposed the deeper struggle against digital colonialism. Internationally, reactions were divided. European leaders voiced concern, but were cautious not to appear heavy-handed. The European Union, already struggling with its own debates on digital sovereignty, found itself caught between sympathy for Africa's stance and fear that their own corporations could be next. China's response was swift. State media praised Africa's decision as a historic victory for multipolar technology. Offers of partnership flowed in from Beijing, with promises of low-cost hardware training and joint ventures. Russia followed suit, with officials framing the event as part of a broader realignment of global power away from the West. But perhaps the most revealing reactions came from ordinary people in the United States. Comment sections on major news sites lit up with polarized views. Some argued that Africa had shot itself in the foot, predicting chaos without Amazon's infrastructure. Others, however, admired the boldness of the move, drawing parallels to the American Revolution. "If they can do it, why can't we?" one commenter wrote, pointing to U.S. concerns about dependence on big tech monopolies. The climax of this moment was not just in the speeches or headlines, it was in the symbolism. Screens going black across AWS terminals in Seattle, while in Africa, those same screens lit up with new locally hosted platforms. For the first time in living memory, Africa was not the subject of a global tech story, it was the author. In the hours that followed, financial analysts calculated losses. Amazon had shed $30 billion overnight. Investors worried that the company's reputation as an unstoppable force had been permanently damaged. Meanwhile, African leaders framed the event not as an end, but a beginning, the start of an era where Africa would decide how it connects, stores, and shares its own knowledge. And yet the world also understood something larger. This was not just Africa versus Amazon. This was the opening chapter in a global struggle over who controls the digital frontier. The climax had arrived, but the story was far from over. The morning after Amazon Web Services vanished from Africa, the continent did not collapse into digital chaos as many skeptics predicted. Instead, something extraordinary began to unfold. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, ordinary citizens experienced what leaders were calling a digital rebirth. For years, Africans had been told that without Western companies like Amazon, Google, or Microsoft, their internet would crumble. Yet as millions logged into new platforms powered by Africa Cloud, the opposite happened. Services ran smoothly, costs dropped, and for the first time users felt ownership over their digital lives. On the civil front, the immediate impact was most visible in education and healthcare. Universities, which had previously spent millions on AWS hosting, suddenly found their costs reduced by nearly half. Professors in Nigeria proudly announced that student records were now stored locally, immune to the pricing hikes of foreign corporations. In Burkina Faso, hospitals reported that patient data could now be shared securely across regions without the need to route through servers in Europe or America. These were not just technical adjustments, they were transformations that touched the daily lives of millions. Small businesses also felt the change. Entrepreneurs who once struggled with high hosting fees and unpredictable outages on AWS discovered that local platforms offered both stability and affordability. In Lagos, a young app developer named Sola described the shift as like getting the keys to your own house after renting for years. Her words resonated with thousands of others who had long felt excluded from the global digital economy. Now they were building apps, e-commerce sites, and platforms on African soil with African support. But the consequences extended far beyond economics. Politically, the move shattered an invisible barrier. For decades, African governments had been criticized for relying on foreign powers to safeguard their most sensitive information. With AWS gone, that narrative flipped overnight. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré framed the decision as a declaration of independence equal to the great anti-colonial struggles of the 20th century. We fought for our land, he said in a televised address. Now we fight for our data. The symbolism was powerful. Citizens who had grown weary of hearing about corruption, dependency, and foreign meddling suddenly saw their governments taking a proactive stand. Protests that once demanded jobs or clean water now also included banners calling for digital sovereignty. For the first time, African youth saw their governments leading on an issue that directly shaped their future. Yet the political consequences were not without risks. Western governments began signaling that Africa's decision could carry diplomatic costs. Some hinted at reduced aid or trade negotiations being reconsidered. American lobbyists argued that cutting ties with AWS endangered counterterrorism cooperation since U.S. agencies relied on data-sharing agreements. African leaders, however, pushed back, countering that sovereignty was not negotiable. They framed the warnings as proof that the West had long treated African data as a resource to be extracted, no different from gold or oil. Inside Africa, the political map began to shift as well. Governments that joined the Africa Cloud Initiative quickly found themselves at the center of a new coalition. Countries that hesitated faced pressure from their own citizens to follow suit. Opposition parties across the continent began accusing their ruling elites of being digital collaborators if they resisted the transition. In civil society, the movement sparked new conversations about rights and responsibilities. Activists emphasized that sovereignty alone would not guarantee freedom, that African governments must ensure privacy protections and prevent authoritarian misuse of the new infrastructure. Journalists warned that a homegrown internet could either empower citizens or become a new tool for control depending on how leaders handled it. The debate was intense, but it reflected something new. Africans were finally arguing about how to shape their own digital future rather than waiting for decisions made in Washington or Silicon Valley. Ultimately, the civil and political consequences of AWS's collapse in Africa converged on one reality: the balance of power had shifted. For the first time in history, Africa was not reacting to technological change imposed from abroad. It was leading that change, forcing the world to respond. And whether one viewed it as a triumph or a gamble, no one could deny that the continent had just rewritten the rules of the digital age. From Washington to Brussels, from Beijing to Moscow, the world looked at Africa's defiant move with a mixture of disbelief, anxiety, and admiration. For the United States, the loss of Amazon Web Services across an entire continent was not simply a corporate setback, it was a strategic shock. America had long considered its technology companies as extensions of its global influence, projecting power not through armies or fleets, but through platforms and networks. The sudden unplugging of AWS was therefore interpreted as a direct challenge to U.S. hegemony in the digital domain. In Washington, policymakers scrambled to assess the implications. The National Security Council reportedly held late-night meetings to evaluate whether Africa's new digital sovereignty could undermine U.S. intelligence operations. AWS had been more than a cloud provider. It had served as an informal bridge for cooperation on counterterrorism, cyber defense, and financial oversight. Losing that bridge meant the U.S. would now have to renegotiate access, this time on Africa's terms. For a nation accustomed to dictating conditions, that was a bitter pill to swallow. The business community was equally shaken. Wall Street analysts downgraded Amazon's stock outlook, warning that other regions could soon follow Africa's example. If Latin America or Southeast Asia decided to build their own cloud independence, the entire business model of big tech could unravel. The fear was not just about lost revenue, but about precedent. Africa had proven that resistance was possible, and that alone was revolutionary. Across the Atlantic, Europe's reaction was conflicted. On one hand, European leaders had been debating their own digital sovereignty for years, often complaining about dependence on American tech giants. Africa's bold step gave credibility to those arguments. On the other hand, Europe feared being left behind. If Africa developed its own platforms while Europe hesitated, the EU could find itself squeezed between two poles: American giants and a rising African digital bloc. Some commentators in France even warned that Paris had lost Africa twice, first in resources, now in data. China's response was the most opportunistic. Within hours of Africa's announcement, Chinese state media framed the event as proof of a shifting global order. Beijing offered partnerships, infrastructure loans, and technical expertise, portraying itself as a natural ally in the struggle for independence from U.S. dominance. For China, Africa's digital sovereignty was not only a business opportunity, but also a geopolitical victory, weakening Washington's grip and expanding Beijing's influence. Russia, too, seized the moment, praising Africa's courage and offering cybersecurity cooperation. Moscow's narrative emphasized the theme of multipolarity, a world where no single nation or company could dictate terms to others. Whether practical or rhetorical, Russia's support added to the sense that Africa was now a front line in the contest between old powers and new challengers. Global civil society also weighed in. Activists in Latin America and Asia celebrated Africa's stand, drawing parallels with their own struggles against economic and technological dependency. Editorials in major newspapers asked whether Africa had just started a domino effect that could reshape the global internet. The symbolism was undeniable. A continent long portrayed as a follower had suddenly become a leader, and the world was forced to pay attention. For the United States, the question was no longer whether Africa's decision mattered. It clearly did. The real question was whether Washington would respond with hostility, attempting to punish African nations, or with humility, seeking genuine partnerships. That choice, many argued, would define America's relationship with the global South for decades to come. One thing was certain: the balance of digital power had shifted. Africa's move against AWS was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger global reckoning. The world had entered an era where sovereignty was no longer measured only by borders or armies, but by who controlled the invisible infrastructure of the internet. And on that battlefield, Africa had just delivered a stunning blow: $30 billion gone overnight. One of the world's most powerful corporations shut out of an entire continent. What happened in Africa was not just a technical shift, it was a warning to the world. The age of unquestioned dependence on American tech giants is ending. A new age defined by sovereignty, pride, and risk has begun. But the story does not end here. For Africa, the challenge is only beginning. Building independent infrastructure is one thing, protecting it from sabotage, corruption, and authoritarian misuse is another. Will Africa truly use this new freedom to empower its citizens, or will new elites seize the opportunity to control and profit in the same old ways? For the United States, the question is equally sharp. Will Washington respond with cooperation or with punishment? The answer could decide not only Africa's digital future, but also America's moral standing in the 21st century. And then there is the global stage. If Africa can stand up to Amazon today, who will stand up to Google tomorrow, to Microsoft, to Facebook? This moment forces all of us to ask who really owns the internet we depend on each day. Is it the people or the corporations? So I turn the question to you. Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's vision for digital independence is the beginning of true reform? Or is it a gamble too dangerous for Africa to carry alone? Can we continue to trust his strategies, or should someone else be prepared to take his place? Please share if you feel you are one of the first to support President Ibrahim Traoré. And subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines. The digital revolution has begun, and you are watching history unfold.
The heartbeat of African resistance. We bring you raw, unfiltered updates on Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, the man challenging the global system. If you believe in truth, power, and a rising Africa, this is your home. Subscribe now. Stand tall. Stay woke. Young Patriots, where revolution lives.